911, where's your emergency?
Someone just got shot at Sally's.
Okay.
It was a car that drove by.
AJ and his friends had no idea what was to come.
He was just walking to the store. That was all he was doing.
I ran down the street, and there's this young guy screaming.
KJ!
The faster we can solve it, and get somebody in custody, the better.
I don't think any of us ever imagined what he would really do next.
Yeah. Yep, bro.
18-year-old student and rising athletics star, Kelvin Taylor, lovingly known as KJ, lives at home with his parents.
Feeling positive, man. It's all in the mind.
I loved Kay so much. Kay just was special to me, his dad, our family, his classmates, his friends. There was no doubt in KJ's mind that his mother loved him, nor his father. We both loved the ground he walked on.
He was raised right. He was raised by a great mother and father. Every room he walked in, it got brighter, you know, and if you was having a bad day and you seen KJ, you smiled. He was someone you just needed to be around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not for sure.
When I got home from work, KJ was on his phone sitting on the end of the couch.
All right, bye. Hey, Mom.
Hey, kiddo.
How was your day?
Oh, good, honey.
I heard his friends was on the motorcycles. And he said, Mom, I'll be back.
Oh, I'll see you for dinner.
Okay.
And I just looked up, and he got on the back of the bike. And they left. Kay was just different.
KJ is only just starting to fulfill his extraordinary athletic talent on the field.
Kay loved to play sports. Kay was a sports person. He was always playing football, from football to basketball, from basketball to AAU basketball, back to football. He was always in a sport.
God had blessed him with just raw talent. He could move, he could run, he could control his body better than anybody. From day one, you knew that he was special.
He really had the potential to be a next Tavon Austin or Wes Welker. He was the total package. He had everything that you were looking for in a player.
He knew what he didn't have in the neighborhood when he was growing up. And so he wanted to go to school, and he wanted to become successful.
All right, boys, let's go. Let's go.
He was great in other sports like basketball, but football was his calling. Football was Kay's way out of here.
Hey!
He was wise. He knew that football was going to open doors for him and change his life. This is the journey that he was on.
In 2020, KJ helped his high school team become state champions and had his eye on West Virginia college football and beyond.
There's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't be watching my nephew on Saturdays. He said that once he made it, his plans was to come back and build a training facility to help train the youth and get them as best prepared to be successful and go further than him.
Let's go, bro. I got you.
The thing about KJ, he was going to be great, no matter what he did.
Where's your emergency?
Hello, somebody just got shot up in here on Central Avenue. Someone just got shot at Sally's.
Okay.
It was a car that drove by.
Damn, I just heard shots. I'm looking out my window.
Dispatchers were receiving 911 calls that a shooting had occurred. There had been multiple shots fired in the Central Avenue area of Charleston, West Virginia.
Attention 408. Reported shooting, 829 Central Avenue. Time now 2013.
Officers were actually in the area, pretty close by.
Charleston Police Department arrived on scene within seconds of the actual shooting.
They arrived on scene. It was really chaotic.
They weren't sure that the shooter had fled the scene. They approached that scene with caution.
They located the victim laying on the ground. Said a single gunshot wound to the chest. Several other people around him frantically trying to give him assistance. Some people were saying it was a truck had driven by and fired several shots, which struck the victim. Everybody on scene said, "Hey, that's KJ Taylor."
There was a knock at the door, and it was my homegirl. But she was out of breath.
It's KJ! KJ!
And she screamed, "KJ just got shot."
Metro Medic 437. Response to the area, Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue.
I ran down the street. It is so many people out there, like, so many people. And there's this young guy screaming.
Let me through! That's my son! KJ!
I'm trying to get through there, and the police won't allow me to get to there. And all I see is my son, laying on the ground.
KJ was Tara Richmond's only son. He was the light in his mother's eyes. As a parent, I can't imagine what Tara went through.
KJ is rushed to the ER.
Me and my husband chased that ambulance all the way down the street. And then one of my homegirls pulled it up, and she drove us to the hospital.
Soon after, Charleston detective John Hill arrives at the crime scene.
What we got? It was still kind of chaotic. There was tons of people everywhere. We put the crime scene tape kind of farther back to where it gives us space to process the scene.
They're having to worry about, the collection of evidence and the preservation of evidence, keeping that crime scene secure.
I walked over to the corner where it occurred, right in front of the corner store. And there were several bullet holes into the window. The first thing we look for is usually like shell casings. The bullet fragments, so we did find several bullet fragments that went through the window of the corner store. If we locate a possible weapon, we can kind of tie it back to that scene. The faster we can solve it and get somebody in custody, the better.
It was close to 9 p.m. when Tara Richmond received the news that no parent ever should have to receive.
And they told us that they did everything they could do. My mama didn't make it. And it crushed me. And I've been crushed ever since.
Well, as I'm walking through the hospital, I see my brother and my sister-in-law come walking out of the hospital. Both of them had their heads down, crying. I just remember looking at them, thinking to myself, no. No. Not Kay. Not Kay. No.
KJ had never had any problems with the police, but there's several incidents that have occurred, like shootings in the past, around the corner store there. I knew there was a camera on a pole based on other investigations that I've had. If it was active, if it was working, it might help us out, might identify who was there with KJ and get an actual video footage of the incident.
I would not be able to sleep until I got to see what was on that camera, because of the potential of what it could bring to the investigation.
You ready?
Ready. We get a license plate, we can track that license plate down to see, who the vehicle's registered to, who's the owner, where they live at. Because sometimes the video's clear enough to where you actually see inside of vehicles and see faces. Could make or break your case. It's what we live for as police officers.
Can you cue it up to just before 7 p.m.? Okay, play it from there.
As soon as I open it up, I see the corner store, the Central Avenue, Glenwood Avenue. I see the entire area where the incident occurred. We see KJ and his two friends. They show up on scene riding dirt bikes.
It's a weird feeling because you're getting ready to watch the last moments of someone's life, and they have no idea that it's coming.
Rewind. Freeze it.
They're coming down Glenwood Avenue.
Play on.
They turn in front of the corner store.
Zoom in.
KJ was wearing a red shirt. Park their dirt bikes, get off, kind of hanging out and talking to people right in front of the store.
Hold it. Play it again.
You see one of KJ's friends go inside, and KJ's wearing this red shirt. He's just kind of standing outside, waiting on his friend to get out.
There it is. Rewind. Play it again. Zoom in.
You see KJ approaching the store as he is getting closer to the door. You see the suspect vehicle come into view.
You see it come by at a high rate of speed.
You see a very brief moment where they hit the brakes.
You actually see muzzle flash coming off the glass of the store.
There were multiple shots fired.
And then KJ falling. And then the suspect vehicle continues fleeing the scene, and next thing you know, it's chaos. People are running around.
These are not grown men, these are children. And they are running, and they are hiding, they are afraid. It's heartbreaking. This is not just a video. This is real life. And this is a moment where a child is stolen from their family.
Rewind.
We pause it, see if I can get a good picture of who's in that truck.
Zoom in.
You could not see who was driving that vehicle. You could not distinguish what the license plate was.
While the poll camera was beneficial for us and that it showed the actual shooting, at that point we didn't know anything about the occupants of the vehicle.
All we know is that truck is the suspect vehicle. Whoever was in that truck, that's the person that killed KJ Taylor.
Without a license plate to trace the vehicle, Detective Hill canvasses the area for more cameras.
KJ and his friends fled from the scene, traveling east on Central Avenue towards Five Corners. And it's the intersection on the west side of Charleston that a bunch of streets all meet at once. We need to check at these spots. There's a business right there at Five Corners that has a great camera that points right at Central Avenue. Maybe if they stopped at the light, I could see inside and maybe see some faces.
Detective Hill takes the hardware store footage back to the station.
Can you cue it up to 6:50 p.m., please? Sure. Scroll it on, please.
All of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle's flying at a high rate of speed.
Rewind.
I rewinded it, paused it, and did step by step, frame by frame. And as I'm watching it, I look in and I can see, hey, there's two people in that truck.
Zoom in.
We got to see how big they were. We got to see what they're wearing.
And I could see the driver's got a white shirt on and the passenger's got a red shirt on. Usually the passenger is the one who's firing because we're not focused on driving.
I can't make out the license plate.
With no more leads from the CCTV, police track down one of KJ's friends, seen running away from the scene.
Thank you for coming in. I'm Detective Hill. This is Detective Marsh.
He was brought into the Criminal Investigation Division. He was very upset. He and KJ were friends. He was traumatized.
We want to know, has KJ had any problems with anybody?
Do you know who shot KJ?
No. Everyone loved him.
He said he didn't have any problems with anybody. He didn't have any enemies. He said that he was at the 2nd Avenue Center, which is a community center, there a couple blocks away, playing basketball and hanging out with KJ and some other friends. Maybe something happened there. Maybe something happened while they were playing basketball. Maybe something happened while they were riding dirt bikes in the street. It could be somebody that they knew that they got in an argument with, or it could be a complete stranger.
Detective Hill retrieves the security footage from the community center to see if anything occurred prior to the shooting.
Can you start at 6:50 p.m.? Okay, play it from there. There they are.
They were just hanging out, having fun, talking to friends, riding their dirt bikes up and down the street, just having a normal evening.
Rewind. Okay, play it from there.
There's some people in vehicles. There are some other people just kind of gathered around. Everything seems fine.
Scroll it on, please. Okay, play it from there.
They're starting to load up on their bikes to leave. And next thing you know, I see the suspect vehicle passing them.
There's the truck.
Immediately passes them, kind of swerves around them. Hits his brakes, and turns up a street.
Can you switch to the second camera? Rewind. Okay, play it from there. Freeze it. Looks like they're stalking them.
Watching the video, it became obvious that KJ and his friends had no idea. They had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Detective Hill still has no information on the truck.
Freeze it. Zoom in. It's no use. I can't make out the license plate.
Detective Hill returns to the community center and retraces the path the truck traveled before passing KJ.
We began just walking around the streets, seeing what we could see, and we found several cameras on some houses.
Good afternoon, sir. Detective Hill. Is your camera working?
We have this one residence that's pointing kind of towards 2nd Avenue.
Can you cue it up to 7:50 p.m.?
And all of a sudden, there it goes. The suspect vehicle comes up the street and turns right on 2nd Avenue.
Rewind. Can you go frame by frame?
I see it's a Ford F-150. And then I start also seeing other things that kind of break it down to make it a little bit more identifiable.
Freeze it.
It's two-tone. It's two-tone silver and gray. It's what we call either a step side or a flare side truck. It's just a different model of an F-150.
Zoom in.
We're doing what we can do to try to figure out what we can see from the license plate, but I really can't make out much other than that it's the West Virginia license plate.
But the video is good enough that a member of public might recognize the truck.
So the decision was made to release the video to media, social media, anywhere we could just to get it out there to maybe we can get some kind of tip or some lead to follow up on.
As the hunt for the killer continues, Kelvin Taylor's funeral takes place.
It was held in the Vicks Coliseum in Charleston.
It was just so many people. It was overwhelming.
Mayor, police chief, I believe, a couple pastors, high school coaches, friends, family, people that we didn't know, that he impacted himself.
The outpour the people gave to me and my husband was unreal.
I tried not to cry, but the tears flow down my face. But just to see everybody show up and support their family and him, well, it was amazing. It gave people a sense of like, we got to stick together. But when you look in the front, you see KJ in the casket. It tears you apart.
But if it wasn't for that outpour, we probably wouldn't know where we would be at right now.
That Sunday, I came into the office. I noticed that I had gotten a voicemail.
1:37 p.m.
And it was the individual saying that they believed that they were the owner of the vehicle that we had released to the media. So I immediately contacted them.
She was able to provide a description of the vehicle with the make and model.
You sold it to who?
They told me that they were the owner of the truck, but they had sold it months prior.
Do you know who has it now?
Try to get as much information as I can about that person. We got to track them down.
That's great. Thank you, ma'am.
Detectives stake out the address of the person said to be the new owner, but there's no sign of the truck.
I get a phone call from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. They had just received a call from an anonymous tip saying that the suspect vehicle was parked in between some trailers up in an area called Halls Drive. I immediately began traveling to Halls Drive. We pull up, and I see it for the first time. A silver and gray two-tone Ford F-150.
They were able to seize that vehicle to allow an opportunity to get a search warrant to later search that vehicle.
Efforts to follow up on the original owner's lead hit a dead end.
Hill speaking.
But investigators receive an anonymous tip linking the vehicle to a man named Dakotas. Detective Hill has heard the name before.
Thanks for letting me know.
Dakotas Thomas. His name had been brought up several times with the Charleston Police Department. He was always just on our radar, and I knew that he was a violent guy. He was a dangerous guy. We needed to check it to see if it's Dakotas Thomas driving the truck.
The license plates have been removed, but Detective Hill finds the truck's unique vehicle identification number.
I took the VIN number from the truck and placed it in our database. I learned that the truck had actually got an oil change on April 7th, which was the day of the homicide. I need to go to the garage that the oil change was done at and see what I can find out.
your cameras work?
I spoke with employees there who were able to print me out a receipt, which gave me the time of the oil change.
It was somewhere around 2:30 in the afternoon when the oil was changed in the truck.
Can you play it from 2:30 p.m., please?
We began watching the surveillance video. We're looking for who's in that truck.
Look, freeze it. Rewind. Play it again.
I see the truck pull in. I can't make out any faces.
Can you switch to the interior camera?
It showed the truck there, but it did not show the passenger that well.
When you're seeing the red shirt, the same as the video footage from Andrews Flooring and Hardware.
The passenger may be obscured,
Can you switch to the second camera?
but the driver, wearing a white t-shirt, is clearly visible.
Which is, again, like that video footage from Andrews Flooring.
Look, zoom in.
As soon as I saw that, I saw his face, I was through the roof ecstatic.
The person driving the vehicle was Dakotas Thomas. Being able to put a face to this crime was very important. We knew at that point that we had at least one of the suspects identified, one of the people that were involved in this murder identified.
To find the shooter in the passenger seat. First, we needed to capture Dakotas Thomas.
Police find the details of Dakotas Thomas's last known address, a trailer in Poker, Putnam County.
I obtained a search warrant for the trailer. We made an approach on the trailer. Your adrenaline stopped. You never know what you're going to experience. You never know what you're going to find. Your senses are heightened.
This guy's certainly considered armed and dangerous.
We made our approach on the trailer. Made entry into it.
All clear, guys?
We did not locate anybody inside. During our search, we located a red hooded sweatshirt. There was a burn mark in the lower back part. I was like, hey, this could be something.
With Dakotas seen wearing a white t-shirt, the red hoodie could belong to the passenger and suspected shooter, whose identity remains unconfirmed.
The next morning, we began processing the interior, which is taking DNA swabs from the door handles, the steering wheel, from the F-150 pickup truck.
During the search of that vehicle, It was noted that there was a particular burn mark in the passenger seat. That red shirt showed a burn mark that would have lined up with the burn mark in the seat of the truck. Law enforcement officers believed at that time that a shell casing had been ejected from the firearm and fallen behind the individual that was in the passenger seat.
And as I'm looking at the burn mark, I noticed in between the crack of the seat, between like the back of the seat and where I actually sat down at, I see a bullet fragment. So I started looking around inside the truck, and I noticed that the B pillar, which is like where the door meets the truck, that it had been struck by a bullet.
It would have been impossible for the passenger to be able to have caused that type of damage.
And after seeing that, I knew that it had to be the driver that fired the shots at KJ.
The driver and the shooter involved in this murder was Dakotas Thomas. Dakotas Thomas became public enemy #1.
A warrant was executed to allow those officers to what we call ping his cell phone. They were able to pull information from both before and after the shooting.
Through his cell phone records, we learned that after he was in the area where he dropped the truck off of, he immediately appeared to flee toward Ohio.
There was a reward that was placed for anyone who could provide information of the whereabouts of Dakotas Thomas. But it felt there were a lot of people that refused to talk to the police.
KJ was killed in April, and it went all the way to August.
Finally, law enforcement officers received a tip from an individual who knew the whereabouts of Dakotas Thomas.
We kind of narrowed it down to an address in Akron, Ohio area.
That is when the U.S. Marshal Task Force closed in. He was a murderer. We all knew there was a significant concern for what he might do.
We needed to get him off the street.
I don't think any of us ever imagined what he would really do next.
People do crazy things trying to avoid capture. You know, they don't want to spend the rest of their lives in jail.
That encounter turned violent. It turned volatile, which is quite the understatement. He barricaded himself in and began throwing Molotov cocktails at the U.S. Marshal. Unfortunately for Dakotas, one of those cocktails didn't make it outside and set the house on fire that he had barricaded himself in.
So now he's in a bit of a pickle.
He attempts to escape through a window, eventually ends up on the roof of this residence.
At that point, he gave up, and the local fire department came with their ladders, got him off of the roof, and the marshals were able to take him into custody.
Once I got the phone call that they had Dakotas Thomas in custody and actually got a picture of him in handcuffs sitting in the back of a police car, after all the hard work, all the long nights, all the long days of watching video, talking to people, everything that led up to this moment I was so excited. I knew he had it.
Burn the house down. That might be something else, but not for me.
Dakotas Thomas is found guilty of the murder of KJ Taylor, and on December 2nd, 2022, is sentenced to life without parole. Dakotas Thomas admits he was targeting one of KJ Taylor's friends over a disagreement.
The video is telling us what happened. They played basketball. They were just hanging out, having fun, just having a normal evening. AJ and his friends had no idea that this truck was following them. They had no idea that what was to come.
Dakotas Thomas was reckless enough to discharge a weapon from a moving vehicle in a very crowded area.
And KJ Taylor was the one who was hit.
We watched that video probably hundreds of times, and every time that we watched it, we hoped that it wasn't going to happen that time. We hoped that he wasn't going to get shot that time, but of course that's what the video showed.
I never really understood how big of a role video surveillance plays until this case.
That footage is really what blew the case open. That footage is what gave us the truck so that we could go from there and try to figure out who it was that had done the shooting.
I do not believe that law enforcement officers would have been able to solve this crime in the absence of video footage.
KJ Taylor was a son. He was a friend to a lot of people. He was a mentor to a lot of children, and he was just starting his life. You know, KJ didn't get into any kind of trouble. He was doing the right thing, and unfortunately, his life was cut short.
KJ was real, you know, and I admired that so much about him, that there was no fluff. There wasn't a KJ that you got as an adult, and then he walked out the door and was somebody else there. You know, you knew where KJ stood every day.
I think we should remember Kay as somebody that made it. Somebody that grinded for what he wanted. Somebody that would give you the shirt off of his back if he loved you and he knew you loved him.
Losing him really made this community a better place. It drove people. It made people take life more serious in our community. So, but it's hard, you know.
In the weeks following, the street KJ grew up on is renamed in his memory.
The street is so special to his parents and his family and his friends in the community. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm glad that street is there because he deserves it.
I want the world to know the truth about KJ. Like, KJ was a great guy, you know, because I love the girl he walked with. I just love him. And
The neon glare of Miami's Biscayne Boulevard does not reflect the truth. It merely distorts it, painting the surface of the dark Atlantic in brilliant, deceptive strokes of electric pink and deep sapphire. In July of 1979, beneath the sweltering, cocaine-fueled haze of a city drowning in sudden, illicit wealth and unprecedented violence, a cold-blooded horror was buried so deeply into the mangrove swamps that everyone assumed it had been swallowed by time itself. It began not with a cartel execution or a public shootout, but with an eerie, quiet vanishing that paralyzed the city's wealthy elite. A luxury yacht, its twin engines idling aimlessly 3 miles off the coast of Key Biscayne, drifted through the early morning fog. The deck was pristine. The champagne glasses were half full, their bubbles long evaporated under the brutal Florida sun. But 24-year-old heiress and fashion designer Clara Montgomery was entirely gone. She was a fixture of the high society circuit, a young woman whose face graced the covers of local magazines and whose family name was synonymous with real estate empires and political influence. She was not a runaway. She was a woman of fastidious discipline, a perfectionist who never missed a board meeting and never left her penthouse door unlocked. When her private security detail stepped onto the drifting vessel 12 hours later, they didn't just find an empty deck. They walked into a biological vacuum. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no missing jewelry, and no ransom note. It was a phantom abduction, a crime so perfectly executed that the Miami Police Department stood paralyzed before the void for 47 agonizing years. The headlines slammed onto the front pages of the Miami Herald with a structural violence that mirrored the chaotic era: the Key Biscayne vanishing, high society horror, the ghost yacht murder. Every wealthy associate, every ex-lover, and every prominent corporate rival became a target of burning suspicion, causing legacy families to retreat behind massive iron gates and hire private, armed guards to shadow their children through the sun-drenched streets. The golden hours of the investigation bled into frantic weeks, then into desperate months, and eventually into the slow, agonizing crawl of a case turning completely cold. The files were bound in heavy cardboard, stamped with the tragic, definitive ink of a cold case, and relegated to the humid, fluorescent-lit basement archives of the county courthouse, left to collect the fine, invasive dust of a changing century. 47 years of absolute silence. 47 years of a mother dying with her eyes fixed on the front door, of a family fortune fractured by private investigations, and of veteran homicide detectives retiring with the burning sting of an unpunished evil weighing down their souls. The world moved on, transformed by glass skyscrapers, digital algorithms, and the fast-paced rush of the modern era. The old nightclubs where Clara danced were demolished, her contemporary generation faded into old age, and the name Clara Montgomery became a tragic piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered at country club bars about the dangers lurking beneath the glittering surface of the Magic City. But secrets held by the dying have a violent, explosive way of demanding light when the flesh begins to fail. The turning point did not come from an advanced DNA database match or a sudden discovery in the Everglades. It came from the sterile, hushed confines of a luxury palliative care suite in Palm Beach in 2026. A 78-year-old man, his body withered by terminal illness, his breaths tracked by the rhythmic, mechanical beep of a heart monitor, demanded a priest and a stenographer. He was a pillar of the Miami Chamber of Commerce, a billionaire philanthropist whose corporate developments define the modern skyline, a man who had rubbed shoulders with governors and international tycoons for 5 decades. But as the shadows of his own mortality closed in, the psychological armor of his absolute privilege cracked wide open. His deathbed confession did not just shock the community, it shattered its very history, unmasking the prominent businessman as the cold-blooded architect of the 1979 execution, revealing that the monster had never been a phantom passing through the night, but had built his entire financial empire on top of a secret grave, breathing the ocean air as a free and worshipped king while his victim remained a ghost in the dark. The relentless Florida humidity of 1979 did not just stick to the skin. It seemed to preserve the rot of a city that was rapidly transforming into the murder capital of the United States. To truly comprehend the devastating weight of the 2026 revelation, one must strip away the modern, computerized veneer of Miami and step directly into the chaotic, neon-drenched turbulence of July 1979. This was a city under siege by its own geography. Billions of dollars in illicit cash were flowing through the cargo bays of Miami International Airport and the private docks of Coconut Grove, completely rewriting the local economy. Money was moving so fast that banks couldn't count it. High-rise construction was exploding along Brickell Avenue, and the line between legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise was becoming dangerously blurred. Yet, within this landscape of sudden fortunes, the Montgomery family represented old-world stability. They were the architects of early Miami, a dynasty whose real estate holdings dated back to the turn of the century. Clara Montgomery was the crown jewel of that empire, a 24-year-old visionary who refused to merely live off her family's trust funds, establishing a high-end fashion label that was beginning to capture national attention. The day she vanished, July 14, 1979, was a Saturday defined by a heavy, suffocating heat wave that brought the city to a grinding halt. Clara had boarded her family's private 36-foot cabin cruiser, the Stardust, at the private marina in Key Biscayne. Her itinerary was supposed to be a solo, 3-hour cruise to clear her mind before the launch of her autumn collection. She was an experienced sailor, a woman who had navigated the tricky currents of the Biscayne Bay since her childhood, and she possessed a reputation for meticulous preparation. When the Stardust failed to return to its slip by sunset, a quiet, aristocratic panic began to vibrate through the Montgomery estate. By midnight, the United States Coast Guard and the Miami Police Department's Marine Patrol had launched a full-scale search sequence, their searchlights cutting through the black Atlantic water like long, silver blades. When they finally located the vessel at 4:30 a.m. on Sunday, drifting aimlessly 3 miles southeast of Cape Florida, the scene that greeted the boarding officers was deeply chilling because of its absolute stillness. The sea was calm as glass, reflecting the early morning stars. The Stardust was completely operational. Its twin inboard engines were ticking over smoothly in neutral, the fuel tanks were 3/4 full, and the electronic navigation systems were active. On the mahogany table in the main cabin sat 2 crystal glasses, each containing a small residue of vintage champagne, alongside an open bottle that had gone warm and flat in the night. Clara's leather handbag, containing her identification, her keys, and thousands of dollars in cash, was resting on the navigation station. Her designer sandals were placed neatly next to the companionway steps. But Clara was gone. The initial forensic sweep of the vessel, commanded by lead homicide detective Edward Vance, was a primitive exercise compared to modern digital standards. In 1979, the concept of trace DNA did not exist. Investigators relied on the manual lifting of latent fingerprints using black carbon powders and silver nitrate solutions. The cabin of the Stardust yielded dozens of partial prints, but the majority were smudged, obscured by the high humidity and the salt air that quickly corroded biological evidence on fiberglass and chrome. The champagne glasses were carefully preserved, packaged in cardboard boxes, and transported to the crime lab downtown, but the print ridges recovered from the glass stems were too incomplete to match against the state's manual card catalog registry. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no tears in the upholstery, and no foreign fibers to indicate an ambush. It was as if Clara Montgomery had simply stepped off the edge of the world into the dark water. The behavior profile of the victim completely rejected the theory of an accidental drowning or a voluntary disappearance. Clara was a passionate swimmer, an athlete who knew the dangers of the local undertows, and she was in the middle of the most successful week of her professional life. She had no history of mental illness, no drug dependencies in an era when the city was drowning in substance abuse, and her personal ledger showed an absolute stability. This realization forced Detective Vance to a dark, unyielding conclusion. Clara Montgomery had been taken from that boat by someone she trusted completely. Someone who had boarded the Stardust either at the marina or from a secondary vessel out on the open water. Someone whose presence did not trigger an immediate instinct to reach for the emergency radio or fight back. The investigation quickly became a high society scandal that paralyzed the city's corporate elite. Detective Vance and his team spent weeks interviewing every prominent figure who frequented the exclusive clubs of Key Biscayne and Star Island. They cross-examined ex-boyfriends, rival fashion designers, real estate competitors, and the crew members who worked at the private marinas. The pressure from the Montgomery family was relentless. They hired private intelligence operatives from London and Washington, offering a $500,000 reward, an astronomical fortune in 1979, for any information that could break the silence. The headlines in the Miami Herald and the Miami News grew increasingly frantic. The heiress of the mist, the secret guest on the Stardust. Silence in the Bay. Among the individuals interviewed during those first frantic weeks was a 25-year-old rising star in the real estate development sector named Julian Cross. Cross was a handsome, charismatic operator who had recently formed a corporate partnership with the Montgomery family to develop a massive tract of prime waterfront land along Brickell Avenue. He was a frequent guest at the Montgomery estate, a man who had been seen dancing with Clara at the exclusive Mutiny Club in Coconut Grove just days before her disappearance. When interviewed by Detective Vance, Cross was the absolute picture of shattered, professional grief. He sat in the interrogation room, wearing a tailored linen suit, his eyes red from apparent sleeplessness, his voice trembling as he offered his full cooperation. "She was the lifeblood of our new project, Detective," Cross had whispered, his hands gripping a porcelain coffee mug. "We were building a future together. I've spent the last 48 hours on my private boat, checking every mangrove key from here to Elliott Key. If someone has taken her, they have destroyed the best part of this city. I will put every resource of my company at your disposal to find her." His alibi for that Saturday afternoon was rock solid by 1979 standards. He claimed he had been attending a private corporate luncheon at the Jockey Club with 3 prominent international bankers until 3 p.m., after which he had returned to his penthouse apartment to prepare for a Sunday board meeting. The bankers confirmed his presence at the luncheon. His building's doorman recalled seeing his silver sports car pull into the garage around 4 p.m. In an era before cell phone tracking, GPS breadcrumbs, and ubiquitous surveillance cameras, there was no digital grid to challenge his timeline. He was a wealthy, connected white-collar professional whose corporate ambitions aligned perfectly with the city's growth. He was placed on the periphery of the file, classified as a close associate, and left behind as the investigation ground to a halt. As the months bled into years, the frantic urgency of the Montgomery case began to curdle into a stagnant, suffocating BTAC. The sea refused to surrender her body, no clothing washed ashore, and no ransom demands were ever made. The file shrank from a daily priority to a heavy, dust-covered box stored in the basement archives of the police headquarters on West Flagler Street. Detective Vance watched with a bitter, growing resentment as the city's homicide rate exploded in the early 1980s, the cocaine cowboys era turning Miami into a war zone, forcing his department to abandon old mysteries to deal with the fresh corpses stacking up in the morgue every single day. The name Clara Montgomery slowly faded from the daily news cycles, preserved only by the eternal, agonizing devotion of her family's wealth. Clara's mother, Evelyn Montgomery, transformed her grief into an obsessive, decades-long crusade. She refused to close her daughter's fashion boutique, keeping the rent paid and the garments hanging on the racks for 20 years like a museum of a frozen life. She spent millions on private detectives, forensic experts, and psychic consultants, traveling across the world to follow useless tips that led to dead ends in South America and Europe. She died in 2002, her hands clenching a photograph of Clara, her final words a whispered demand to her surviving attorneys to never let the file be destroyed. Her husband followed her 2 years later, his heart breaking from the long, slow erosion of an unresolved tragedy, leaving the vast Montgomery fortune to a maze of charitable trusts with explicit instructions to fund any future technological investigation into the case. Meanwhile, Julian Cross did not merely survive the passage of time, he conquered it. Over the next 4 decades, he used the land assets acquired after the restructuring of the Montgomery Partnership to build a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. His construction cranes defined the Miami skyline throughout the 90s and the 2010s, erecting shimmering glass towers that transformed Brickell Avenue into the Wall Street of the South. He became a billionaire philanthropist, a man whose name was etched in bronze over the entrances of university libraries, medical centers, and art museums. He advised governors, hosted presidential candidates at his oceanfront estate, and was celebrated as one of the founding fathers of modern Miami. He had compartmentalized the year 1979 so perfectly that it seemed to have never existed in his history. What Cross failed to realize, what his immense wealth could not protect him against, was the absolute, unyielding arithmetic of mortality. The body eventually fails, no matter how many corporate boards you control or how many politicians you have on your payroll. In June of 2026, at the age of 78, Julian Cross was admitted to the VIP palliative care pavilion of a high-end medical center in Palm Beach, his lungs failing from advanced terminal cancer, his biological clock ticking down its final, definitive hours. Surrounded by clean white sheets, high-end medical equipment, and the quiet, artificial serenity of a multi-million-dollar death watch, the psychological armor he had worn for 47 years finally began to fracture under the weight of his impending judgment. The human mind, when facing the absolute void of death, does strange and violent things. For 47 years, Cross had gone to sleep knowing he had committed the perfect crime, that he had outrun Edward Vance, outrun the FBI, and outrun the memory of the city. But as the morphine dripped into his veins, the ghost of 1979 breached his defenses. He began to experience vivid, terrifying auditory hallucinations. He claimed he could hear the sound of lapping water against a fiberglass hull and the voice of a young woman calling his name from the corner of his dark hospital room. On the evening of June 18, 2026, he demanded that his primary private attorney, a senior partner at a prestigious Miami firm, bring a digital recording device and a Catholic priest to his bedside.
He was ready to speak.
He was ready to sign his name to a truth that would tear modern Miami's history apart at the seams. The rhythmic, mechanical beep of the cardiac monitor inside the ultra-exclusive palliative suite was the only sound competing with the sudden, heavy downpour of a summer storm slamming against the reinforced glass windows. The air inside room 412 was sterile, climate-controlled, and thick with the chemical odor of intravenous medications and the cold, static aura of impending death. On that white bed, engulfed by a labyrinth of wires and clear plastic tubes, Julian Cross looked nothing like the bronze-skinned titan who had dominated the real estate markets of the American South for 5 decades. His frame was hollow, his skin translucent and gray, pulled tight over a skull that seemed to be already rejecting the living world. But his eyes, dark, intense, and bloodshot, burned with a frantic, terrifying clarity as he looked at his senior corporate attorney, Robert Sterling, and Father Michael Thomas, who stood frozen at the foot of his bed. Sterling held a high-definition digital audio recorder in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the red recording button. He was a man who had spent 30 years burying corporate liabilities for Cross Holdings, but he knew that what was about to spill into the room was an absolute nuclear detonation that no legal maneuver could contain. The digital counter on the screen began to track the seconds in tiny, green numbers, marking the exact moment a 47-year-old empire of deception began to collapse from within. Let the record show. Sterling's voice was a tight, dry whisper. This is a voluntary deposition taken from Julian Cross at the Palm Beach Medical Pavilion on June 18, 2026. Present are Robert Sterling, counsel for the deponent, and Father Michael Thomas of the Archdiocese of Miami. The deponent is fully conscious, of sound mind, and has explicitly demanded to create this statement for immediate delivery to the state authorities. Cross let out a long, wet rasping breath, his chest rattling beneath the cotton hospital gown. He lifted his right hand, the skin bruised black from weeks of intravenous lines, and gestured for the priest to step closer. When he spoke, his voice was not the commanding baritone that had swayed city councils and international banking consortiums. It was a rough, jagged hiss, carrying the dry rattle of a man whose lungs were filling with fluid. "I don't need a legal defense anymore, Robert," Cross whispered, his eyes rolling back slightly as a wave of physical pain rippled through his face. "The lawyers can't file an injunction against what's waiting for me on the other side of tonight. For 47 years, I've been praised as a visionary. I've had my name carved into marble entryways on Brickell Avenue. But every stone I laid in this city was built on top of a horror. I need the priest to hear it, but I need the police to have it. I need the weight off my chest before the machine goes flat." Cross paused, swallowing hard, his gaze locking onto the digital recorder as if it were a physical portal to his past. He closed his eyes, and within 3 breaths, the sterile hospital room vanished from his consciousness, replaced by the suffocating, neon-tinged heatwave of July 1979. It wasn't a cartel hit, and it wasn't a random robbery. Cross said, his voice dropping into a steady, hypnotic cadence that held the absolute finality of a confession. I killed her. I killed Clara Montgomery. I did it because I was greedy, because I was arrogant, and because she was the only human being in Miami who saw through the fraud I was running before I became a billionaire. According to the verbatim statement that would leave the state attorney's office paralyzed with shock less than 12 hours later, the corporate partnership between Julian Cross and the Montgomery family in 1979 was an absolute illusion. Cross, a 25-year-old speculator with immense charm but zero liquid capital, had secured the rights to develop the prime waterfront acreage on Brickell Avenue by presenting falsified bank guarantees and forged international funding letters to Clara's father. He had leveraged his social standing and his relationship with Clara to gain access to the family's inner sanctum, positioning himself as the golden child of the new Miami boom. But Clara Montgomery was not just a socialite or a fashion designer. She possessed a razor-sharp financial mind and a relentless obsession with structural detail. On the morning of Friday, July 13, 1979, while reviewing the land title registrations and the escrow accounts for the joint venture, she discovered a series of massive irregularities. Cross had covertly embezzled $3 million from the construction escrow accounts, moving the cash through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to fund his own private options, trading, and personal luxury assets. She realized that the entire project was a massive, high-stakes pyramid scheme that would destroy her family's legacy if it came to light. She called me from her office at 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon. Cross whispered, a single bead of sweat rolling down his hollow temple. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten me. She spoke with that cold, aristocratic precision that always made me feel like an outsider. She told me she had compiled a complete audit file. She said she was going to board the Stardust on Saturday morning to clear her head, and when she came back to port on Sunday night, she was going straight to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. She gave me 24 hours to prepare my surrender. Cross let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a violent coughing fit, his monitor spiking into a frantic rhythm before he settled back onto the pillows. She thought she was safe because she was a Montgomery. She thought the rules of her world protected her from the grit of mine. She didn't understand that in Miami in 1979, $3 million wasn't just money. It was a variable worth 100 lives. Cross spent the night of July 13th calculating his countermove with the same cold, tactical efficiency that would later make him a legend in corporate real estate. He knew he couldn't stop her on land. Her office was secure, her penthouse was guarded, and any sudden accident in the city would immediately draw the scrutiny of her family's private security detail. But out on the open water of the Biscayne Bay, the rules changed. Out there, the ocean was an infinite expanse of shadows, a place where people vanished every single week into the chaos of the smuggling lanes. On Saturday morning, July 14th, Cross tracked the Stardust from the shore as it cleared the marina at Key Biscayne. He boarded his own 24-foot high-speed speedboat, the Corsair, under the pretense of taking a solo fishing trip to Elliott Key. He kept his distance, tracking the distinctive white profile of the cabin cruiser through long-range marine binoculars as it cruised 3 miles off the coast, eventually dropping anchor near a secluded reef system southeast of Cape Florida. I pulled up alongside the Stardust at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Cross said, his voice dropping into a harsh, guttural whisper that made Father Thomas reach for his rosary beads. The sun was blinding. The water was so bright it hurt your eyes. She was sitting on the aft deck in a white sundress, drinking champagne and reading a legal brief. When she saw my boat, she looked surprised, but she didn't panic. She knew me. She had danced with me 3 nights before at the Mutiny Club. She thought I had come out there to beg for a settlement, to offer her a corporate compromise. Clara allowed Cross to board the Stardust, throwing him a mooring line so he could tie the Corsair parallel to her hull. He stepped onto the mahogany deck, carrying a leather briefcase under his arm that he claimed contained the missing financial documents and a complete restructuring proposal for the Brickell project. Clara led him down into the air-conditioned main cabin, pouring him a glass of champagne as she sat at the navigation table, ready to review his terms. She opened the briefcase, Cross whispered, his eyes staring wide at the ceiling as if the scene were being projected onto the white plaster above him. There were no documents inside. There was nothing but 2 heavy, lead-lined industrial diving weights and a 50-foot roll of reinforced nylon rope. Before she could even process what she was looking at, I hit her. I struck her across the temple with a solid brass winch handle I had slipped into my waistband before boarding. She never made a sound, Robert. She just collapsed onto the cabin floor, her dress staining crimson as her head hit the mahogany edge of the table. The details of the next hour, delivered by the dying billionaire with a terrifying, clinical detachment, provided the definitive answer to the forensic mystery that had baffled 3 generations of homicide investigators. Cross did not panic. He worked with the cold precision of an engineer executing a technical task. He used a specialized chemical solvent to wipe down every surface he had touched inside the cabin, removing his own fingerprints while ensuring Clara's prints remained intact on her glass and personal belongings to simulate a sudden, voluntary departure from the vessel. He then carried Clara's unconscious body up the companionway steps, transferring her into the deep cargo bay of his own speedboat. He retrieved her financial audit file from her desk, dropping the papers into a portable steel incinerator box he had brought on the Corsair, watching her evidence turn to gray ash over the open ocean water. He then started the Stardust's twin inboard engines, setting the throttles to dead idle and locking the wheel in neutral, ensuring the boat would drift aimlessly in the Gulf Stream currents, a ghost ship holding onto a false narrative. I drove the Corsair 20 miles out into the deep water, past the edge of the continental shelf where the Atlantic drops into 3,000 feet of absolute darkness. Cross whispered, his breath growing shallow, his heart monitor pacing faster. I wrapped the nylon rope around her waist and her ankles, securing the lead diving weights with a series of maritime knots that would never slip. She was still breathing, Robert. Her pulse was weak, but she was alive when she went over the side. I watched her go down through the blue water until she vanished into the blackness. The ocean swallowed her whole, and I knew right then that I had won. I knew there was no technology on Earth that could find a body at that depth in 1979. Cross returned to his private slip in Coconut Grove by 4 p.m., bypassing the main marina office by utilizing a secure, corporate key card he had acquired through his development holdings. He showered, changed into a linen suit, and attended a high-profile political fundraiser at the Vizcaya estate that evening, smiling for the society photographers while Clara Montgomery's body was settling into the deep silt of the Atlantic Trench. The confession concluded with a desperate, breathless plea for immediate delivery to the authorities. Cross signed the printed transcription with a jagged, trembling scrawl of his pen, his hand collapsing onto the sheets the moment the ink dried. Robert Sterling did not hesitate. He knew his duty under the ethics of the bar. He walked out of the palliative pavilion into the torrential rain, stepped into his luxury sedan, and drove straight toward the Miami Police Department's headquarters on North Miami Avenue, carrying a digital drive that would break a 47-year-old silence and turn a city's history completely inside out before the sun could rise over the bay. The transmission of a billionaire's dying words into the encrypted data servers of the Miami Police Department did not trigger a sudden, cinematic blast of sirens through the rain-slicked streets of downtown. Instead, it produced a cold, paralyzing silence that froze the entire night shift of the Cold Case Homicide Unit. At 2:14 a.m. on Friday, June 19, 2026, the digital audio file containing Julian Cross's guttural, wheezing confession completed its upload sequence, its raw waveform appearing on the terminal monitor of lead investigator Alejandro Vance. For Vance, a man whose own father had retired from the very same department with the unsolved file of Clara Montgomery weighing like a physical deformity on his conscience, the sound of that wealthy, dying voice detailing the mechanical precision of an execution was a psychological sledgehammer. The interior of the Homicide Bureau was wrapped in the flat, clinical glare of overhead LED bars that hummed with a low-frequency electrical vibration. Outside the glass partitions, the tropical storm was peak-shifting, throwing dense sheets of heavy, gray water against the reinforced windows, turning the neon skyline of modern Brickell Avenue, the very skyline Julian Cross had built with his corporate cranes, into a distorted, bleeding mosaic of pink and blue light. Vance sat perfectly static, his fingers hovering over his mechanical keyboard, his eyes locked onto the digital transcription scrolling side by side with the audio playback. Beside him stood Assistant State Attorney Victoria DeShazo, her face a mask of absolute, unblinking legal shock, her hand clenching a porcelain mug of cold black coffee until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. "He gave us the exact coordinate mechanics, Victoria," Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, driven register that carried the absolute finality of an executioner. He tapped a finger against the glass of the monitor, highlighting a specific string of numbers near the bottom of the transcribed text. "He didn't just confess to ease his soul, he gave us the precise drop matrix. In 1979, he thought the continental shelf was a black hole that human technology would never breach. He thought 3,000 feet of Atlantic trench water was an infinite vault. He didn't foresee the advent of side-scan sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, and deep-sea satellite mapping. He left a signature on the ocean floor, and he just handed us the combination to the lock." "The legal armor is completely gone, Alejandro," DeShazo replied, her tone hard, precise, and entirely stripped of political hesitation. She reached past his shoulder, hitting the print command on the console to initiate the physical logging of the deathbed statement. A signed confession corroborated by specific, non-public details of the crime scene is an absolute foundation for a capital indictment. But Julian Cross is 78 years old. His organs are failing from stage 4 carcinoma, and according to the medical staff at the Palm Beach Pavilion, he has less than 48 hours of cognitive life remaining. "We cannot prosecute a corpse. If he dies before we can execute a formal arrest warrant and put him under the physical custody of the state, this case closes with a historical footnote rather than a judicial verdict. We need an immediate, high-priority judicial authorization to place a guard outside his door and secure a formal medical deposition before a magistrate." The mobilization that followed was a masterclass in modern administrative warfare. While the city of Miami slept beneath the blanket of the summer storm, the machinery of state law enforcement moved with a rapid, Don Dap velocity. Within 45 minutes, Vance had synchronized a multi-agency task force via an encrypted digital briefing room, uniting the Miami Police Department, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, and the Specialized Marine Recovery Units of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. The objective was two-pronged, operating simultaneously on land and sea. A tactical unit would secure the dying billionaire in his Palm Beach palliative suite, while an elite deep-sea salvage vessel would deploy into the Gulf Stream to locate the final resting place of Clara Montgomery, using Cross's verbatim coordinates to pull her history out of the dark. At 3:45 a.m., a convoy of 3 unmarked state utility vehicles slipped out of the police headquarters garage, their tires hissing violently against the flooded asphalt of Interstate 95 as they accelerated north toward Palm Beach. The air inside the lead vehicle was thick with operational tension and the sharp, bitter smell of energy drinks and gun oil. Vance sat in the front passenger seat, his tablet displaying the real-time biometric telemetry of Julian Cross, which the department's cyber unit had covertly linked to their command console via the hospital's internal monitoring network. The billionaire's heart rate was a erratic, fluttering wave, dancing between 40 and 110 beats per minute, a biological clock running out of sand in the dark. "The defense firm is already spinning the media perimeter, Alejandro," Detective Miller reported from the rear seat, his fingers flying across a secure terminal that tracked local corporate communications. "Robert Sterling didn't just deliver the file to us. He notified the senior partners at Cross Holdings. They're already putting together an emergency board meeting for Sunrise. They've hired a high-profile crisis management firm from Washington to draft immediate press releases claiming the digital audio file is a product of terminal delirium brought on by high-dose morphine toxicity. They're going to claim their founder was non-compos mentis when he signed that paper, that he was chasing phantoms from his childhood to invalidate the confession before DeShazo can even file the indictment with the clerk. Delirium doesn't generate precise geographic coordinates that match the drift patterns of the Gulf Stream from July of 1979, David, Vance muttered, his eyes fixed on the rain-swept highway ahead. Delirium doesn't accurately detail the dimensions of a 1979 marine winch handle or the specific lead weight configurations used by commercial divers in the late 70s. He knew exactly what he was doing. His mind was clear enough to calculate his evasion for 47 years. It's clear enough to take the fall tonight. We don't argue medicine with his lawyers. We execute the warrant under the authority of the state Supreme Court. When the task force vehicles pulled up to the rear ambulance bay of the Palm Beach Medical Pavilion at 4:32 a.m., the atmosphere inside the luxury facility was one of absolute, suffocating administrative panic. The hospital's general counsel was already standing in the lobby, surrounded by two private security directors dressed in tailored suits who attempted to block the entrance to the elevator banks. The corporate apparatus of modern wealth was trying desperately to throw up a protective wall around its dying king to protect the brand value of a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate from the stain of a capital homicide arrest. Vance didn't pause to engage in an administrative debate. He stepped past the security line, his gold police shield displayed prominently over his wet leather jacket, his left hand holding the hard copy of the capital arrest warrant signed just 90 minutes prior by a state circuit judge. "Step aside, counselor," Vance said, his voice dropping into a stone-cold, unyielding cadence that instantly quieted the lobby. "This is a felony warrant for first-degree murder, breaking and entering with intent to commit a capital offense, and the unlawful disposal of human remains. Under Section 901 of the Florida statutes, my team has total, unrestricted access to the target individual. If anyone in this building attempts to delay, alter, or interfere with the execution of this order, I will arrest them on the spot for felony obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. We're going to room 412, and we're going right now." The elevator ride to the fourth floor felt like a slow, pressurized descent into a tomb. When the door slid open, the carpeted hallway was silent, save for the muffled sound of a television monitor playing a muted news broadcast in a nearby nurse's station. Outside the double doors of room 412 sat Robert Sterling, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional exhaustion and profound defeat. He looked up as Vance's boots struck the floor, but he didn't stand up to offer a defensive argument. He simply nodded slowly, sliding his leather briefcase off his lap, a sign of total surrender from a lawyer who knew that the perimeter had completely collapsed. Vance pushed the heavy wooden doors open, stepping into the sterile gloom of the palliative suite. The tropical storm outside had passed, leaving the sky a flat, bruised violet color that let a cold, pre-dawn light creep through the windows. The room was thick with the smell of old flowers, ozone from the electronic machinery, and the distinct, unmistakable scent of human life coming to its absolute end. On the white bed, Julian Cross lay perfectly static, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, agonizingly shallow rhythm that caused the heart monitor to emit a long, warning beep between every breath. Vance walked to the side of the bed, looking down at the gray, sunken face of the man who had spent 47 years living as a king on top of a secret grave. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pair of standard, stainless steel handcuffs, a ceremonial gesture of authority, but one that carried the absolute weight of a historical debt being paid in full. He didn't click them over the dying man's wrists. Instead, he laid the cold steel chains gently onto the bedsheet next to the suspect's hand, establishing the formal, physical presence of a state's custody over his body. "Julian Cross," Vance spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a piercing clarity that seemed to cut through the heavy, chemical atmosphere of the room. "Open your eyes, Julian. This is the Miami Police Department Homicide Bureau. You are officially under arrest for the capital murder of Clara Montgomery. The state has taken custody of your person, and the net has closed." The older man's eyelids fluttered slowly, opening with an agonizing effort to reveal a pair of cloudy, bloodshot eyes that stared blankly at Vance's shield. For 3 seconds, there was no sign of recognition, no intelligence behind the glass, only the empty, primitive gaze of a creature caught in a trap. Then a subtle, chilling transformation occurred. The pupils focused, the cold, analytical intelligence that had built a real estate empire returning for one final, fleeting moment before the dark took him over completely. He looked at the handcuffs resting on the white sheet, then up at Vance's face, his mouth twitching into a slow, terrifyingly faint curling of his lips, a final, sociopathic gesture of amusement that sent a shiver of pure, primal dread down the detective's spine.
He didn't speak.
He didn't have the breath left to scream or deny it. He simply let out a long, wheezing gasp that sounded like a low, mocking chuckle, his eyes rolling back toward the ceiling as his heart monitor began a sudden, frantic spike that signaled the final collapse of his biological systems. "Get the medical staff in here," Vance ordered, stepping back from the bed, his hand remaining flat on the arrest warrant. "Keep him stable. I want his pulse logged every 10 minutes. He doesn't get to pass away as a free philanthropist. He stays alive until the state attorney files the formal arraignment papers with the court clerk at 9 o'clock this morning. We are holding him in this room under a hard, armed guard." While the tactical unit established their secure perimeter outside the Palm Beach Pavilion, a secondary, equally dramatic operation was unfolding out on the open ocean water of the Atlantic. 22 miles southeast of Key Biscayne, where the continental shelf drops off into the terrifying, ink-black depths of the Florida Straits, the NOAA oceanographic research vessel the Sentinel sat idling against the heavy, rolling swells of the Gulf Stream. The ship was a marvel of modern deep-sea exploration, equipped with high-resolution multi-beam bathymetric sonar systems, deep-tow side-scan sensor arrays, and a state-of-the-art autonomous underwater vehicle, AUV, named the Triton. Inside the ship's dark control center, senior marine archaeologist Dr. Elena Cruz stood behind a bank of high-definition monitors, her eyes locked onto a real-time digital waterfall display that mapped the topography of the ocean floor 3,000 feet below the hull. Beside her stood Detective Ray Fletcher, an old-school homicide investigator who had spent his entire career under the shadow of the Montgomery failure, his face weathered by the salt air, his eyes tracking the digital sensor readouts with a burning, desperate intensity. "We are crossing the exact target coordinate matrix Julian Cross provided in his statement, Ray," Dr. Cruz said, her fingers flying across a tracking console to stabilize the ship's dynamic positioning thrusters against the powerful, northern current of the stream. "The depth here is exactly 3,140 feet. The bottom is a soft, deep silt layer, subject to heavy sedimentation over the last half-century. If her body went over the side with lead weights in 1979, it won't be visible to standard optics. It will be completely encapsulated by the deep-sea mud. We are deploying the sub-bottom profiler array now to pierce the sediment layers." The AUV, the Triton, was launched into the blue water, its thrusters producing a soft, electrical hum as it vanished into the deep, its digital sensors transmitting a continuous stream of acoustic data back to the surface. For 2 hours, the search was a test of absolute human endurance. The monitors displayed an infinite, flat expanse of gray mud, a silent desert buried beneath 3,000 feet of pressurized salt water where the temperature was near freezing and the light of the sun had never reached since the beginning of the world. Then, at 6:12 a.m., as the first rays of the morning sun were turning the surface of the Atlantic into a sheet of brilliant, gold-colored glass, the side-scan sonar monitor emitted a sharp, high-pitched electronic tone. "We have an anomaly, Dr. Cruz," the sensor technician announced, his voice tight with a sudden, electric focus that brought everyone in the room to a dead halt. He pointed a gloved finger at a distinct, localized cluster of signal reflections appearing on the screen. "It's a structural variance in the sediment density. It's too symmetrical to be a natural limestone formation or a biological deposit. It's an object roughly 5 feet, 6 inches in length, showing high-density core targets that match the magnetic signature of heavy lead and reinforced nylon composite material. It's buried exactly 3 feet beneath the silt layer." Dr. Cruz adjusted the tracking optics of the Triton, commanding the vehicle to drop down to within 10 feet of the ocean floor, its powerful high-intensity LED searchlights cutting through the ink-black water to illuminate the deep gray mud. The vehicle deployed its robotic manipulation arms, using a specialized, low-pressure water thruster to gently wash away the top layers of sediment from the anomaly site. As the silt cleared into a cloud of white dust, The monitor screen displayed a sight that caused Detective Fletcher to let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyes filling with a wave of ancient, suppressed emotion. Exposed in the clinical glare of the sub's lights sat a distinct, tightly wound cluster of thick, dark nylon rope, the heavy fibers perfectly preserved by the near-freezing, low-oxygen environment of the deep trench. The rope was wrapped with a complex, military-grade sequence of maritime knots around a central, dark mass that was completely encapsulated by the lead diving weights and the preserved fragments of a white sundress. It was a biological capsule frozen in time, a pristine archaeological record of an act of absolute malice that had sat in the deep dark for 47 years, waiting for the technology of a new century to tear it back to the surface. "Package located, Detective," Dr. Cruz whispered, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly against the control stick. "It's her. It's Clara Montgomery." The coordinates were perfect. The ocean couldn't hold on to his secret any longer. Fletcher reached into his pocket, pulling out a faded, water-stained photograph of Clara from 1979, the image he had carried in his wallet through decades of investigative failure. He looked at her smiling face, then at the digital image of her deep-sea grave on the screen, and felt a profound, exhausting wave of finality wash over his soul. The Phantom was unmasked on land, the evidence was secured at sea, and the city of Miami was about to wake up to a Chandong that would rewrite its history from the bedrock up. The ledger was officially open, and the final march toward a historical verdict had officially crossed the point of no return. The morning sun did not bring clarity to the city of Miami. It rose as a blinding, golden blade that cut through the retreating tropical storm, casting long, stark shadows across the glass and steel canyons of Brickell Avenue. By 7 a.m. on Friday, June 19, 2026, the quiet, clinical precision of the deep-sea recovery operation and the hospital room arrest had collided to trigger an administrative and public relations apocalypse. The digital media landscape did not merely report the news, it fractured under the weight of it. Across every television network, digital news feed, and financial ticker in the state of Florida, a single headline pulsed in continuous, alarming strokes. Real estate tycoon arrested in 1979, heiress murder, vows corporate war from deathbed. The juxtaposition was too jarring for the public consciousness to absorb without a collective shudder. Julian Cross, the legendary billionaire philanthropist whose name was synonymous with the very skyline of modern Miami, had been placed under armed police guard as a capital murder suspect. At the exact same moment, maritime recovery vessels were floating over the Atlantic Trench, preparing to lift the physical remains of Clara Montgomery from a 3,000-foot-deep grave. To the millions of people who lived, worked, and rented inside the towering glass complexes built by Cross Holdings, the announcement felt as though the literal foundation of the city had been revealed to be constructed out of old bones and hidden blood. The illusion of old money, prestige, and modern corporate virtue had vanished within the space of a single news cycle. Inside the grand amphitheater of the Miami Police Department press room, the atmosphere was a volatile pressure cooker of modern journalism. The air conditioning units groaned helplessly against the intense body heat of over 200 reporters who had packed themselves shoulder to shoulder into the small space. Camera operators fought bitterly for positioning along the elevated media decks, their heavy tripods clinking against the concrete floor while a thick forest of microphones sprouted from the central wooden podium. The sound of high-speed digital camera shutters producing a continuous, rhythmic clicking resembled a plague of locusts descending upon a dry wheat field, cutting through the ambient hum of whispered anxieties. When Assistant State Attorney Victoria DeShazo stepped up to the microphones, flanked by lead investigator Alejandro Vance and the chief of police, the sudden blast of electronic camera flashes was so intense it turned the room into a blinding, whitewashed arena. DeShazo was a prosecutor who had spent her entire career navigating the high-stakes intersection of political power and criminal justice, but her face today was an unyielding mask of stone-cold severity. She adjusted her glasses, laid her hands flatly on a leather folder containing the signed capital murder indictment, and looked directly into the glass lenses of the center television cameras. "Good morning," DeShazo began, her voice carrying a sharp, driving resonance that instantly flattened the room into a breathless silence. 47 years ago, a young woman of extraordinary promise and intellect, Clara Montgomery, vanished from the waters of Biscayne Bay. For nearly half a century, her disappearance was treated by the history books as an unresolvable tragedy, a ghost story written into the neon landscape of an era defined by untraceable violence and sudden wealth. Today, the state of Florida is here to declare that the time for myth-making is officially over. The past has caught up with the present, and the armor of absolute wealth has failed to protect a monster from the reach of the law. She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the front row of national journalists who were typing frantically into their laptops. Early this morning, acting under the authority of a capital warrant issued by the 11th Judicial Circuit, homicide detectives took physical custody of Julian Cross, 78, at his medical suite in Palm Beach. Mr. Cross has been formally indicted for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and the unlawful concealment of human remains. This indictment is supported by a comprehensive, signed deathbed confession executed by the defendant, which contains non-public structural details of the crime scene that have been verified with absolute precision by our investigative teams. Furthermore, as I speak to you now, a joint forensic recovery operation has successfully located the physical remains of the victim at the exact deep-sea coordinates provided within that confession. The law does not care how high a suspect's name is carved in bronze over our public institutions. The law does not care how many billions of dollars a corporate entity controls. Justice is an unyielding calculation that eventually balances its ledger, no matter how deep the water or how long the night. The moment DeShazo stopped speaking, the room exploded into an absolute wall of sound, with dozens of reporters leaping to their feet, shouting questions about the sanity of the billionaire, the financial stability of Cross Holdings, and the timeline for the recovery of the body. Standing behind the prosecutor, investigator Alejandro Vance remained completely immobile, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the back exit. He knew that while DeShazo was managing the public arena, the true, savage warfare was already unfolding behind closed doors in the legal suites of the corporate elite. Julian Cross was not a standard street criminal who would sit quietly in a jail ward while the state prepared its case. Even before the ink had dried on DeShazo's press release, the corporate defense mechanism of Cross Holdings had launched a multi-tiered counteroffensive designed to neutralize the confession before it could ever be introduced to a grand jury. By 8:30 a.m., a defensive phalanx of 6 of the highest-priced, most ruthless corporate defense attorneys in the United States had materialized at the Miami-Dade County Courthouse. Led by senior trial counsel Arthur, the Iron Wall, Pendleton, a legendary legal strategist who had spent 40 years shielding international tycoons and politicians from federal indictments, the defense team had already filed an immediate, emergency motion for a protective order and a total stay of all criminal proceedings. Vance walked down the long, echoing limestone corridor of the courthouse's 4th floor, his leather boots striking the floor with a heavy, rhythmic thud that signaled his internal focus. He pushed open the double doors of the state attorney's private conference room, where Detective David Miller was surrounded by stacks of old 1979 case logs, marine blueprints, and a live digital monitor tracking the financial markets. The television on the wall, set to a national business network, showed the stock price of Cross Holdings plunging into a catastrophic, vertical descent, its value erasing billions of dollars in real time as the international financial markets reacted to the founder's murder arrest. Pendleton just filed his initial suppression motions with a circuit clerk, Miller said, looking up from his laptop as Vance entered. His face was a pale mask of exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot from working 48 hours without a single break. He's not playing games, Alejandro. He's already filed affidavits from 3 independent neuropathologists claiming that Julian's confession is a legal nullity. They're arguing that the stage 4 cancer had metastasized to his cerebral cortex and that the high-dose continuous infusions of Dilaudid and midazolam had induced an advanced state of toxic, narcotic delirium. They're going to frame the entire confession as a drug-induced fantasy, a manifestation of terminal dementia, where an old man took local folklore from his youth and synthesized it into a false memory. If they convince a judge that Julian was non-compos mentis when he signed that paper, the confession gets thrown out, and we are left trying to prove a first-degree murder case based entirely on 47-year-old circumstantial files. Delirium doesn't generate a perfect string of satellite coordinate numbers that leads an underwater vehicle straight to a body buried 3 feet beneath the ocean silt, David, Vance said, his voice dropping into a hard, quiet whisper that carried the absolute finality of his father's legacy. He slammed his hand down firmly onto the conference table. Delirium doesn't accurately recount the specific manufacturing model of a 1979 marine winch handle or the weight ratios of lead diving belts used half a century ago. He didn't pull those numbers out of a narcotic hallucination. He pulled them out of his memory because he lived with them every day of his life. Pendleton can hire every medical expert from Harvard to Johns Hopkins, but they cannot argue with the physical reality of that rope on the ocean floor. The coordinates are our anchor. The defense isn't just attacking the medicine, Alejandro, Miller warned, turning his monitor to show a draft of a public statement currently being distributed to the media by Cross Holdings' crisis management firm in Washington. Look at the spin. They are framing this as a gross violation of a dying man's civil liberties. They are claiming the state attorney's office coerced an old, vulnerable, medicated man on his deathbed without his authorized defense team present in the room. They are mobilizing local charities, the university foundations, and the cultural boards that Julian funded to put immense social pressure on DeShazo to drop the charges before Julian passes away. They want him to die with the title of philanthropist intact, so the corporate empire doesn't break apart. We don't let them control the clock, Vance said, his jaw tightening as he reached for his phone to dial the Marine Command Center out on the Sentinel. If Pendleton wants a suppression hearing, we give him one, but we do it with the physical evidence sitting on the table in front of him. I want the deep-sea recovery logs certified by NOAA within the hour. I want the high-definition video of Clara's remains locked into our digital evidence vault. We don't wait for Monday morning. We push for an emergency grand jury presentation today, while Julian is still breathing. 10 minutes later, Vance and DeShazo walked down the grand marble staircase to the secure basement levels of the courthouse, where the grand jury rooms were guarded by armed sheriff's deputies behind windowless, steel-reinforced doors. The atmosphere down here was completely insulated from the chaotic media carnival upstairs. There were no cameras, no corporate lawyers, and no public relations consultants. Under Florida law, the grand jury room is an island of absolute institutional power, a space where 23 local citizens look at raw, unvarnished state evidence to determine whether a capital case has the structural integrity to go to trial. When Vance stepped through the threshold into Grand Jury Room B, the 23 jurors looked up with expressions of intense, burning gravity. They were a cross-section of modern Miami: school teachers, mechanics, municipal workers, and small business owners who lived in the shadow of the massive skyscrapers Julian Cross had built. They had all seen the news alerts flashing on their phones. They all knew that the economic king of their city had been arrested in the dark. But they were about to see the hidden machinery of the crime itself, the cold, industrial details that had been hidden from the light for 47 years. DeShazo stepped up to the podium, her voice losing its public relations polish, turning into a hard, rhythmic weapon that filled the wood-paneled room. Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, the state of Florida is here to ask you for an immediate indictment of first-degree murder against Julian Cross. We are not asking you to judge his wealth, his charity, or his corporate success. We are asking you to look at a box of secrets that sat at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean for 47 years. For the next 40 minutes, investigator Alejandro Vance delivered a presentation that was completely devoid of emotional hyperbole, relying entirely on a devastating sequence of data points. He began by playing the raw audio file of the deathbed confession. The sound of Julian Cross's guttural, wheezing voice filled the quiet room, his dry breath rattling through the speakers as he calmly detailed the exact moment his brass winch handle struck Clara Montgomery's temple in the cabin of the Stardust. The jurors sat perfectly static, their eyes wide with a profound, visceral horror as the voice of the billionaire explained how he had tied the lead weights around her waist and watched her sundress sink through the blue water until it vanished into the blackness of the trench. Vance then displayed the real-time telemetry from the NOAA vessel, the Sentinel. He showed the high-definition side-scan sonar images of the anomaly site, followed by the video footage captured by the underwater vehicle, the Triton. On the screens, the jurors looked down through 3,000 feet of water to see the pristine, tightly wound clusters of nylon rope wrapped around the mass hidden beneath the gray ocean silt. The precision of the match was unassailable. The coordinates provided by the delirious man had dropped a multi-million-dollar research sub directly onto the body of his victim with an accuracy deviation of less than 6 inches. The defense will tell you that this confession is a product of medicine and madness, Vance said, looking into the eyes of each juror, his voice quiet, steady, and carrying the accumulated weight of his father's uncompromised career. They will tell you that an old man's mind unspooled in the dark of his hospital room. But madness does not calculate satellite matrices with the accuracy of a military computer. Madness does not accurately describe the interior weave of a 1979 imported linen fabric or the specific metallurgical composition of a vintage marine tool. Julian Cross kept those details clear in his mind for 47 years because they were the true foundation of his success. He built his empire on top of her grave, and he believed the deep ocean would protect his secret forever. We are asking you to strip away his protection. We are asking you to return a true bill for capital murder. Thorne and DeShazo stepped out into the quiet, limestone corridor, the heavy security doors closing behind them with a sharp, mechanical click that left the room suspended in time. They stood in the dim light, the rhythmic clicking of a wall clock tracking the agonizing minutes of their waiting. They knew that when dealing with a figure of Julian Cross's immense economic stature, a grand jury could hesitate, paralyzed by the potential chaos an indictment might inflict on the city's financial institutions. Exactly 9 minutes later, the heavy oak door swung open, and the foreperson of the grand jury, a weathered municipal transit worker with white hair and a stern expression, stepped out into the hallway, holding a single sheet of official legal parchment. She walked straight toward DeShazo, her face a hard, unyielding mask of institutional justice, and handed over the paper without a single word. The document was signed, dated, and marked with a single, bold checkmark next to the printed text. True bill. The grand jury had unanimously indicted Julian Cross for first-degree capital murder. The corporate shields were officially broken. The legal armor constructed by Arthur Pendleton had met the unyielding reality of the deep-sea recovery, and the billionaire icon of modern Miami was now officially a capital defendant, locked under armed guard in a hospital room where his money, his influence, and his prestige were completely useless against the advancing shadows of his own mortality. Vance looked down at the signed indictment, letting out a long, slow breath that carried the ghost of 1979 out of his lungs. The phantom was unmasked, the body was located, and the final, historic confrontation between wealth and justice had officially crossed the point of no return in a city that would never look at its own skyline the same way again. The unanimous true bill returned by the grand jury did not merely stall the legal machinery of Cross Holdings. It functioned as an institutional demolition charge that reverberated from the secure subterranean corridors of the courthouse directly into the glass-walled executive suites of the financial district. By 10:30 a.m. on Friday, June 19, 2026, the structural narrative of modern Miami was fracturing in real time. On the trading floors, the corporate valuation of Cross Holdings suffered a historic, near-vertical collapse, erasing billions of dollars in equity within minutes as international investment funds rapidly liquidated their positions to escape the spreading stain of a capital homicide prosecution. Yet, while the global markets panicked, a far more savage, localized warfare was erupting within the secure judicial chambers of Circuit Judge Marcus Thorne on the 9th floor of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse. The air inside Judge Thorne's private hearing room was thick, stagnant, and heavily pressurized, smelling of old leather-bound case law, fresh digital printouts, and the bitter, sharp scent of black coffee that had gone cold in the cup. This was not a public courtroom filled with spectators and flashing television lenses. It was a clinical, windowless arena of high-stakes legal combat where the public relations strategies of the elite were stripped away, leaving only the raw, unvarnished geometry of the law. Lead investigator Alejandro Vance sat on the left side of the long mahogany conference table, his uniform jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled tightly to his forearms, his eyes locked onto a thick stack of medical logs that had just been delivered via courier from the Palm Beach Medical Pavilion. Beside him sat Assistant State Attorney Victoria DeShazo, her face set into a hard, unyielding line of prosecutorial focus. Across the table stood the defensive phalanx of Julian Cross, a multi-million-dollar wall of corporate legal power led by senior counsel Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a legendary figure in the Florida bar, a towering, silver-haired strategist whose face was weathered by decades of high-profile litigation and whose voice possessed a rich, theatrical resonance that had rescued senators, international financiers, and cartel associates from federal indictments. He stood with both hands resting flatly on the polished wood surface of the table, leaning forward with an aggressive, predatory intensity that ignored the presence of the investigators, focusing his entire gaze on Judge Thorne, who sat behind his elevated desk reviewing the emergency motions for a total stay of proceedings. Your Honor, what we are witnessing today is an unprecedented, unconstitutional exercise in investigative desperation, Pendleton argued, his voice booming through the small chamber with a calculated, rhythmic authority. He gestured toward a thick, blue-bound binder containing medical affidavits from 3 independent neuroradiologists. The state attorney's office has marched into this courthouse brandishing a grand jury indictment that is built entirely on a foundation of medical exploitation. They have taken the incoherent, drug-induced mutterings of a 78-year-old grandfather who is in the final, agonizing stages of terminal somatic failure, and they have framed it as a voluntary confession of first-degree murder. This isn't a statement of truth, Your Honor. It is a pharmaceutical mirage. Pendleton slammed his hand down firmly on the binder, his eyes narrowing as he glared at DeShazo. The medical records from the Palm Beach Pavilion are unassailable. At the exact hour this recording was made, Julian Cross was receiving a continuous, high-dose intravenous infusion of Dilaudid, combined with intermittent boluses of midazolam to manage his severe oncological pain. Any competent physician will tell you that this specific narcotic cocktail induces a profound state of toxic delirium, advanced cognitive disorientation, and transient confabulation. My client was experiencing a terminal breakdown of his cerebral architecture. He was synthesizing local folklore from the late 1970s, a tragic, unsolved local mystery that he had read about in newspapers for 40 years, and his medicated mind incorporated that history into a false memory. To use this product of a dying man's narcotic hallucination to strip him of his liberty and destroy his corporate legacy is an administrative outrage that should shock the conscience of this court. DeShazo stood up slowly, her physical posture entirely relaxed, but her voice cutting through Pendleton's rhetoric with the sharp, clean precision of a surgical blade. Your Honor, counsel's performance is an artful attempt to perform for a board of directors that is currently watching their stock price disintegrate on television. But the law does not operate on corporate anxiety. It operates on physical corroboration. If Julian Cross was experiencing a toxic, narcotic hallucination when he created the statement, then we must ask ourselves how a delirious mind possesses the supernatural capacity to calculate deep-sea satellite coordinate matrices with a mathematical margin of error of less than 6 inches. She reached into her folder, pulling out a series of high-definition digital radar and sonar logs and sliding them across the table directly into Pendleton's space. These records are from the NOAA research vessel the Sentinel. Acting on the precise, 24-digit numeric sequence provided by the defendant within that hallucination, deep-sea autonomous vehicles dropped 3,000 feet through the Atlantic Trench this morning and located the physical remains of Clara Montgomery. Delirium does not calculate deep-sea drifts from 1979, Your Honor. Delirium does not accurately detail the metallurgical specifications of a vintage marine winch handle or the weight ratios of lead diving belts used half a century ago. Julian Cross did not pull those details out of a pharmaceutical cloud. He pulled them out of his memory because he had lived with them every single day for 47 years. The physical reality of that body on the ocean floor is an anchor that no medical affidavit can pull loose. Judge Thorne adjusted his glasses, looking down at the sonar images showing the tightly wound nylon rope wrapped around the mass hidden beneath the gray silt of the trench. The silence inside the chamber became total, heavy, and profound, broken only by the distant, muffled vibration of a construction crane working on a high-rise down the street. He turned his eyes toward Pendleton, his jaw set into a firm, uncompromised line of judicial authority. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Thorne spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an absolute finality that caused the defense team's junior partners to freeze over their laptops. The arguments regarding the defendant's medical condition and the chemical composition of his palliative regimen are significant matters for a cross-examination at a full trial. However, for the purposes of an emergency stay and the suppression of an indictment at this preliminary stage, the standard of proof required by this court is one of probable cause and structural integrity. The state has presented a signed, recorded statement that is corroborated by the immediate, precise location of physical evidence that has been hidden from human eyes for nearly 5 decades. That is not a mirage, counselor. That is an avalanche of corroboration. Judge Thorne picked up his fountain pen, scrawling his signature across the bottom of the state's countermotion with a sharp, definitive scratch of ink. The defense motion for an emergency stay of proceedings is denied. The capital murder indictment stands. Furthermore, given the extreme, terminal nature of the defendant's medical status, the court is granting the state's motion for an immediate, expedited deposition under Rule 3.190 of the Florida Rules of Criminal Procedure. We will convene an emergency judicial session at the defendant's bedside in Palm Beach at precisely 3 o'clock this afternoon. A magistrate will be present, a court stenographer will be present, and Mr. Cross will face a formal, on-the-record preservation of testimony while he is still biologically capable of answering to the state. This court is adjourned. The pen hit the desk with a sharp click that signaled the total victory of Vance and DeShazo's opening gambit. Arthur Pendleton didn't flinch, but his eyes turned into cold, calculated slits as he gathered his documents, his legal armor shattered but his mind already shifting into the next phase of his defensive choreography. He knew that an on-the-record judicial deposition at a bedside was a highly dangerous arena where a single slip from his client could seal his fate forever, or where a fierce, aggressive cross-examination could expose the state's tactics as predatory. He turned on his heel, his entourage of corporate lawyers following him out of the room in a rapid, silent pack, heading toward the parking garage to catch their private helicopters north to Palm Beach. Vance stood by the window, looking out over the city. The sun was hot now, turning the surface of the Biscayne Bay into a sheet of brilliant, blinding silver light that matched the intense, burning focus in his mind. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hitting a speed dial number that connected him directly to Detective Miller, who was currently stationed at the Marine Command post out on the water. "David, the deposition is live for 3 o'clock, Vance said, his voice dropping into a hard, driving whisper against the ambient noise of the courthouse corridor. "Where are we on the physical recovery of the container? I need the forensic technicians to have their hands on that physical evidence before we walk into that hospital room. I want Julian to hear the sound of the chains before he takes his final breath. The crane operators are rigging the lift lines right now, Alejandro." Miller's voice came through the earpiece, distorted slightly by the heavy roar of marine diesel engines and the high-pitched whistle of the Atlantic wind. The NOAA vessel has stabilized its positioning directly over the anomaly site. The underwater vehicle, the Triton, has successfully threaded 4 high-tensile Kevlar recovery straps beneath the central mass of the nylon rope bundle. They are running the hydraulic winches on the main deck at a slow, pressurized speed of 2 feet per minute to prevent any structural fragmentation as the package lifts out of the deep silt layer. The depth gauge is tracking the ascent, 2,500 feet, 2,400 feet. It's moving, Alejandro. The ocean is coming up, and she's coming with it. We will be at the Coast Guard station at port by 1:30 p.m. Maintain the chain of custody with absolute perfection, David, Vance commanded. Every frame of video, every digital sensor log, every turn of the hydraulic spool must be tracked with a unique, unalterable security timestamp. The defense is going to fight us for every millimeter of that rope. Don't let them find a single blind spot in the grid. As Vance left the courthouse, stepping out onto the sun-baked plaza, where the television crews were already broadcasting live updates to a stunned international audience, the clock was ticking down its final, definitive hours. The battle line had shifted from the limestone halls of the city's legal towers to the quiet, sterile room where a billionaire's life was ending. The Phantom was unmasked, the body was ascending through the dark water, and the final, historic confrontation between absolute wealth and historical justice was about to reach its peak beneath the white lights of a palliative pavilion where no amount of money could buy a single extra second of evasion. The high-tensile steel cables of the heavy marine crane on the main deck of the NOAA research vessel the Sentinel groaned with a low, vibrating friction as they coiled around the massive hydraulic winch drums. At exactly 1:12 p.m. on Friday, June 19, 2026, the Whitewater 3 miles southeast of Cape Florida began to churn, roiling with a thick, gray foam as the deep Atlantic Trench prepared to surrender its secret after 47 years of absolute darkness. Detective David Miller stood at the iron railing of the starboard deck, his face crusted with dried sea salt, his eyes locked onto the surface of the emerald water. Beside him stood Dr. Elena Cruz, her hands gripping a digital telemetry tablet that tracked the rapid, vertical ascent of the autonomous recovery platform through the final 100 feet of the water column. The atmosphere on the ship was packed with an intense, breathless solemnity that reduced the loud roar of the twin diesel generators to a distant, meaningless hum. 6 forensic technicians from the Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office stood positioned along the wet deck, dressed in full-body white protective garments, positive pressure hoods, and heavy nitrile gloves, holding a large, industrial stainless steel transport container open to the sky. Every operational step was being tracked by 3 independent, time-stamped digital video cameras mounted to the ship's superstructure, establishing a flawless, unassailable chain of custody that no defense motion could challenge. The depth gauge is at 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, the crane operator announced through the deck speakers, his voice tight, dry, and entirely focused on the mechanical feedback of his controls. We have visual contact with the primary rigging lines. The package is clearing the surface. With a sudden, violent surge of displaced ocean water, the high-performance Kevlar recovery straps broke through the waves, lifting a heavy, dripping mass into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The water cascaded off the object in long, crystal sheets, revealing a sight that caused Miller to take a sharp, ragged breath, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, fierce velocity. Suspended from the crane hooks sat a dense, tightly wound cocoon of thick, dark nylon rope, the fibers perfectly preserved by the low-oxygen, near-freezing environment of the deep seafloor. Wrapped around the center of the bundle were 4 heavy, industrial-grade lead diving weights, their surfaces oxidized into a dull, chalky gray, but their structural geometry remaining entirely intact. Through the gaps in the intricate, military-grade maritime knots, the technicians could clearly see the waterlogged, pristine fragments of a white designer sundress, the exact garment Clara Montgomery had been wearing in the final photographs taken at the Key Biscayne Marina on July 14, 1979. It was a biological and forensic capsule frozen in time, lifted out of the abyss to testify against the man who had built an empire on top of its silence. "Gently onto the deck," Dr. Cruz commanded, her voice trembling slightly through her headset as she guided the crane operator. "Do not let the payload touch the iron sides of the vessel. Lower it directly into the sterile solution inside the transport container." The crane arms swung smoothly, lowering the dripping, historical mass into the stainless steel vault with a soft, wet thud. The moment the Kevlar lines slackened, the forensic technicians moved in with fluid, clinical precision, sealing the heavy metal lid of the container and locking the heavy-duty security brackets with automated, digital locks that recorded the exact GPS coordinate, the exact timestamp, and the exact biometric signature of the handling officers. "The package is secure, David," Dr. Cruz said, turning to Miller, her face pale beneath her baseball cap. The low temperature and lack of marine organisms at 3,000 feet prevented any significant biological decomposition of the clothing fibers and the structural matrix. Every knot Julian Cross tied in 1979 is preserved exactly as he left it. It's an absolute engineering blueprint of a homicide. "Get the transport helicopter ready," Miller ordered, turning on his heel and heading toward the ship's satellite communication console to patch through to the land units. "We fly this container straight to the Coast Guard station at port, then load it into a secure medical examiner van heading north to Palm Beach. The state deposition is scheduled for 3 o'clock, and I want Julian to hear the sound of this metal vault closing outside his door before his heart goes flat." While the helicopter's rotor blades began to churn the hot air on the deck of the Sentinel, lead investigator Alejandro Vance was already arriving at the Palm Beach Medical Pavilion in a convoy of 3 unmarked state sedans. The environment here had transformed into a highly militarized legal perimeter. Armed sheriff's deputies stood stationed at every entry point of the hospital's 4th floor, their service weapons drawn, their badges displayed prominently over their tactical vests, blocking off the lines of corporate executives, corporate public relations consultants, and private security guards who were trying desperately to access room 412. Inside the luxury palliative suite, the air was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electric anxiety of a historical reckoning. Circuit Court Magistrate Regina Sterling sat at a temporary wooden desk at the foot of the white bed, her official judicial seal resting on top of a portable digital transcription terminal managed by a licensed court stenographer. On the right side of the bed stood Assistant State Attorney Victoria DeShazo and Investigator Vance. On the left stood Arthur Pendleton and his team of 3 junior defense partners, their faces grim, cold, and calculated, their pens poised over legal pads as they prepared for a savage, final defense of their client's multi-billion-dollar name. In the center of the room, engulfed by a labyrinth of clicking intravenous monitors, plastic oxygen lines, and clear medication bags, Julian Cross lay in a state of advanced somatic collapse. His breaths were short, shallow, and rattle-heavy, his chest rising with an agonizing, erratic effort that caused the cardiac monitors to emit a continuous, warning tone every 4 seconds. His silver hair was damp with sweat, his eyes closed tight, his thin, white hands clenching the bedsheets as the final, internal war between medicine and mortality neared its definitive end. "Let the record show," Magistrate Sterling announced, her clear, authoritative voice slicing through the mechanical clicking of the medical machinery. "This is an emergency judicial deposition taken under Rule 3.190 of the Florida Rules of Criminal Procedure, convened at the bedside of the defendant, Julian Cross, inside the Palm Beach Medical Pavilion. The purpose of this proceeding is the preservation of testimony in the matter of the state of Florida versus Julian Cross, case number 26CR9240. The court notes that the grand jury returned a true bill for first-degree capital murder at 11 o'clock this morning. Mr. Cross, can you hear my voice? Open your eyes and state your full name for the record." The older man didn't move immediately. For 10 agonizing seconds, the room remained completely static, the only sound being the heavy, wet rattle inside his lungs. Then, with an immense, visible physical effort, Julian Cross opened his eyes. The pupils were cloudy, ringed with gray, but as his gaze swept across the room, passing past his lawyers, past the magistrate, and locking directly onto Alejandro Vance's gold police shield, a sudden, terrifying flash of hyper-focused intelligence returned to his features, the same predatory focus that had allowed him to manipulate the real estate markets of Miami for half a century. "Julian Cross," the billionaire whispered, his voice a rough, dry hiss that carried the distinct rattle of fluid filling his bronchial tree. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as he forced the words out against the heavy weight of the morphine dripping into his veins. "I can't hear you, Judge. I know exactly who you are, and I know why. These people are standing in my room with their machines. Your Honor, I must interpose a formal, standing objection to the commencement of this proceeding," Arthur Pendleton interrupted, stepping forward with an aggressive, theatrical authority that attempted to dominate the small space. He placed a hand over Cross's trembling shoulder. "The biometric indicators on that monitor demonstrate that my client is currently experiencing catastrophic septic and respiratory failure. He is under the influence of continuous, high-intensity narcotic infusions that have completely compromised his cognitive faculties, his short-term memory, and his legal capacity. This is not a deposition, Your Honor. It is a state-sponsored interrogation of a dying, medicated elderly man. Any testimony gathered under these conditions is inherently coercive, unreliable, and a direct violation of his rights under the 14th Amendment. The objection is noted for the record, Mr. Pendleton. Magistrate Sterling replied, her tone cold, clinical, and completely unimpressed. She adjusted her glasses, looking directly at the defendant. Mr. Cross, your counsel has argued that you are not of sound mind, that your medication has caused you to experience delusions, and that your previous statement was a product of terminal delirium. I am asking you now on the record under the penalty of perjury. Do you understand the nature of the charges against you, and do you stand by the statement you signed last night regarding the death of Clara Montgomery? Cross let out a short, wheezing gasp that sounded like a low, bitter chuckle, a sound that filled the sterile room with a chilling, sociopathic arrogance. He shifted his head slightly on the pillow, his dark eyes burning as he glared directly at his own defense attorney. "Shut up, Arthur," Cross whispered, his words falling into the room with a heavy, definitive drop of iron weights, instantly silencing the silver-haired lawyer. He looked back at Vance, his mouth curling into a slow, terrifyingly faint smile. Pendleton wants to protect the stock price. He wants to preserve the family trust. But he doesn't have to face what I see every time the lights go down in this room. I don't have time left for his legal choreography. The numbers don't lie, Judge. I gave the detective the exact coordinate grid. I gave him the numbers because I memorized them on the water. In 1979, I didn't pull them out of a morphine cloud. I pulled them out of my soul. The door to the palliative suite clicked open sharply, and Detective David Miller stepped inside, his clothes damp from the tropical rain, carrying a sealed, high-security digital drive and a certified copy of the marine recovery logs. He walked straight to the foot of the bed, looking down at Cross with a hard, unyielding intensity. "Your Honor," Victoria DeShazo spoke, her voice cutting through the room with the sharp, clean precision of an executioner's blade. "Let the record show that at 1:30 p.m. today, the NOAA research vessel the Sentinel successfully recovered the physical remains of Clara Montgomery from the exact coordinates provided by the defendant. The physical packaging, the 4 lead diving weights, the military-grade nylon rope, and the fragments of the white sundress corroborates every single sentence of the defendant's statement with a margin of error of 0. The evidence is inside this building now." The announcement hit the room like a physical kinetic charge. Arthur Pendleton's face went completely pale, his pen slipping from his fingers to click loudly against the mahogany table, his legal armor completely destroyed by the rapid, dawn-dap velocity of the state's physical corroboration. The junior defense partners stared down at their laptops in a state of absolute, paralyzed silence, realizing that the multi-million-dollar defense strategy they had spent 24 hours constructing had just been ground to dust by the reality of the deep-sea recovery. Cross looked at the digital drive in Miller's hand, his chest rattling as he let out a long, shuddering sigh that caused the cardiac monitor to emit a sharp, frantic spike. The realization that the ocean had finally surrendered his secret, that his perfect crime had been pulled out of the 3,000-foot abyss and was sitting just feet away from his bed, did not break his composure. Instead, it seemed to release the final, unholy tension that had held his body together for 47 years. "She's out of the water," Cross whispered, his eyes rolling back slightly as a wave of absolute, biological finality crossed his translucent features. He looked at Vance one last time, his voice dropping into a guttural, fading thread that made the court stenographer lean forward to capture the vibration. "I told you. I won the game, Detective. For 47 years. I breathed the ocean air. I built the towers. I collected the billions. I lived exactly the life I wanted to live. And your system couldn't touch me until I was already through the exit door. You didn't beat me, Vance. You just arrived. to clean up the debris. The heart monitor display screen suddenly transformed, the rhythmic, electronic peaks flattening into a single, continuous, and high-pitched tone that filled the room with a terrifying, absolute finality. The green line went flat. "The target is coding," Vance barked, stepping back as the hospital's emergency medical team flooded past the security line, carrying a crash cart and defibrillator paddles into the center of the room. They ripped open the billionaire's hospital gown, charging the machine, their voices shouting technical medical commands as they slammed the plastic pads onto his hollow chest, his body jolting violently against the mattress under the force of the electric current. But it was over. The biological clock had run completely out of sand. After 3 consecutive attempts to restore a rhythm, the primary physician looked up at the magistrate, shook his head slowly, and reached up to click off the warning alarm on the monitor, plunging the room into an abrupt, stunning silence. "Let the record show," Magistrate Sterling spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she looked down at her terminal. "The deposition is terminated at precisely 3:12 p.m. due to the clinical death of the defendant, Julian Cross. This judicial session is concluded." Vance didn't move immediately. He stood by the side of the bed, looking down at the empty, gray face of the man who had spent his entire adult life living as a king on top of a secret grave. He reached out, picked up the cold stainless steel handcuffs he had laid onto the bedsheet hours before, and slid them back into his leather belt with a sharp, mechanical click. Julian Cross had escaped a state prison tier, he had escaped a public cross-examination, and he had escaped the ultimate degradation of a life sentence in a maximum security cage. He had used his mortality as his final legal maneuver, stepping through the exit door before the hammer of justice could fall upon his head. But as Vance walked out of the palliative pavilion, stepping into the bright, hot Florida sunshine where hundreds of television cameras were already broadcasting the flash news of the billionaire's death to a stunned international audience, he felt a profound, heavy wave of redemptive finality wash over his soul. The phantom of modern Miami was officially dead, his corporate empire was in ruins, and his victim's body was finally resting in a forensic clean room downtown, stripped of the dark water and the heavy lead weights that had held her in the dark for 47 years. The truth was finally out in the air. The cold case was officially broken, and the city of Miami would never look at its own glittering skyline the same way again. The flatline on Julian Cross's cardiac monitor did not bring an end to the narrative. It merely shifted the velocity of the trauma from the sterile confines of a palliative suite into the open, bleeding veins of the city's economic and social infrastructure. By 4 p.m. on Friday, June 19, 2026, the formal announcement of the billionaire's clinical death, occurring less than 5 minutes after he verified his deep-sea execution grid on the judicial record, acted as an institutional demolition charge across the state of Florida. The media apparatus did not just report the transition, it dissolved into a hyperkinetic, breathless storm of live coverage. The digital ticker tapes running across the glass facades of downtown towers and the screens of millions of smartphones shifted from a criminal investigation into a historical autopsy, flashing in relentless, blinding strokes of crimson text. Cold case solved. Billionaire Julian Cross dies in custody after bedside deposition. Clara Montgomery's body recovered. To understand the sheer, tectonic violence of the shockwave that dismantled the Cross empire over the next 48 hours, one must look at the immediate, catastrophic unraveling of Cross Holdings. The company was not merely a real estate firm, it was a multi-billion-dollar sovereign entity that owned the literal sky over Miami. It controlled thousands of luxury residential units, massive commercial banking complexes, and critical infrastructure leases that tied the municipal government directly to the founder's personal capital. The moment the medical examiner's van cleared the gates of the Palm Beach Pavilion, carrying the corpse of a recorded serial predator who had just confessed to using his early corporate partnership to slaughter an innocent heiress, the financial markets reacted with a predatory fury that resembled a feeding frenzy in oil-slicked waters. The board of directors at Cross Holdings convened an emergency, closed-door session at their State Street headquarters at 5 p.m. The atmosphere inside the 34th floor boardroom defined by absolute panic, administrative triage, and the sharp, chemical odor of cold sweat and premium paper. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows looked out over a city that was drowning in the golden light of a summer dusk, but inside, the faces of the senior partners were pale, gray, and hollowed out by the realization that their entire asset portfolio was now legally classified as the fruit of a poisonous tree. Every land title acquired after the 1979 restructuring of the Montgomery Partnership, every skyscraper erected on top of that stolen waterfront ground, and every commercial contract signed by Julian Cross over a 47-year career was suddenly subject to an unmitigated avalanche of civil litigation, state asset forfeiture, and federal racketeering investigations. The civil asset forfeiture units from the state attorney's office are already drafting the freeze orders on our primary escrow accounts, stated Chief Financial Officer David Vance, his fingers trembling as he tapped a mechanical pencil against a spreadsheet that detailed a $4 billion liquidity crisis. He looked across the mahogany table at Arthur Pendleton, who sat in his leather chair with his tailored linen jacket removed, his silver hair uncombed, his face a hard mask of exhaustion. The international investment consortiums in London and Tokyo are pulling their credit lines as we speak. They aren't waiting for a trial or an administrative hearing, Arthur. They cannot allow their corporate brands to be associated with an entity whose founder wrapped an 18-year-old girl in nylon rope and dropped her into the Atlantic Trench to secure his first land title. We are facing a total default by Monday morning if we don't file for immediate Chapter 11 restructuring and distance the firm from Julian's name. You cannot distance this firm from a name that is carved 5 feet high into the granite foundation of every building we own, David, Pendleton replied, his voice losing its rich, theatrical resonance, turning into a rough, dry rattle that reflected the crushing defeat he had experienced at the bedside deposition. He slammed his hand down firmly on a stack of legal discovery documents. The deposition is an unassailable piece of judicial record. Julian didn't just confess to a murder. He explicitly tied his criminal pathology to the financial origin of this company. He admitted under oath that he embezzled the $3 million from the Montgomery escrow accounts to fund his initial options trading and to secure the title to the Brickell Avenue parcels. Legally, that means every square inch of the Cross Tower, the Plaza Complex, and the Marina development constitutes the proceeds of a continuous criminal enterprise. The Montgomery estate's surviving attorneys have already filed a multi-billion-dollar constructive trust lawsuit in federal court, demanding the immediate seizure and liquidation of all corporate assets to satisfy the historic debt. We aren't fighting to save a brand anymore. We are fighting a rearguard action against a total, systemic annihilation. While the corporate lawyers were preparing their administrative surrender documents behind closed doors, lead investigator Alejandro Vance was walking through the secure corridors of the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's office downtown. The contrast between the chaotic, high-stakes panic of the financial district and the cold, clinical isolation of the forensic laboratory was profound. The basement floor was washed in the harsh hum of specialized air filtration units and the blinding glare of high-intensity fluorescent lamps that left no room for shadows or illusions. In the center of Autopsy Room 3 sat the large, stainless steel transport container that had been lifted out of the Atlantic swells just hours prior. Dr. Elena Cruz and Senior Medical Examiner Karen Vance, Alejandro's sister, a brilliant forensic pathologist who had dedicated her career to reading the silent language of the dead, stood beside the table, clad in heavy, Level 4 biosafety suits and positive pressure respirators. They had just activated the digital tracking optics that would record the microscopic disassembly of the nylon rope cocoon. Alejandro stood behind the reinforced glass viewing partition, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the dripping, dark mass that held onto 47 years of hidden history. The extraction is going to be slow and painstaking, Alejandro. Karen's voice came through the wall-mounted intercom, sounding flat, analytical, and entirely scientific. She adjusted her surgical visor, utilizing a pair of long, sterile forceps to touch the edge of the oxidized lead diving weights. The deep-sea mud and the low-temperature environment have created an incredible preservative field. The nylon fibers have undergone a process of chemical crystallization, turning the rope into a hard, rigid shell that is bonded directly to the cotton fibers of the white sundress beneath it. Every knot Julian cross-tied is a permanent physical record, a signature written in industrial cordage that matches the specific maritime techniques used by commercial dockworkers in Coconut Grove during the late 1970s. Can you isolate the trace biological markers from the weapon impact site, Karen? Alejandro asked, his voice quiet but carrying a hard, driving focus. Yes, Karen replied, using a specialized surgical saw to carefully slice through the first layer of the nylon shell, a sharp, metallic odor of old sea silt and old oil filling the air inside the clean room. The alternate light source scans have already located the fracture matrix along the left temporal region of the cranium. The impact geometry matches a heavy, cylindrical object with a distinct, cross-hatched ridge detail, an exact match for the historical blueprint of a 1979 marine winch handle that Julian detailed in his statement. The bone hasn't degraded. It holds onto the precise kinetic energy of the blow that neutralized her. He didn't just knock her unconscious. The impact caused a catastrophic